Okay, so in the last hour, I will talk about the beast and the sovereign, but do you have any questions before I start with this? I try to make it as clear as possible, this logic of deconstruction, self-deconstruction, so I hope this was understandable. And so you see the problem is that, according to me, Derrida makes it very difficult to contradict the notion of the symbolic, to the extent that what he says is that no science, no materiality is able to take this logic into account, is able to explain why life is, exposes itself from its own movement to its own destruction. Okay? So it would then be impossible for any biology or any physics or even any religion to produce a satisfactory discourse on that. So only philosophy and only this expression of the more than is able to not to explain, but to take that into account. So that's why, according to Derrida, the symbolic in this new sense is irreducible. Okay, so I will turn now to the beast and the sovereign, and you'll see it will be easier because we have already all the concepts, we know the logic. Derrida is presenting, so it will be easier to understand the general argument. So just after class, we'll take the picture, okay? And also, people who want to see me tomorrow, come to me and we'll make appointments. I already have an appointment at 8:30 with Alejandro. I don't know. Yes, and 9 with Alejandro. Then it was supposed to be a day off, but So, okay, so we'll make the appointments. I think right now because okay, and this afternoon we'll have this general discussion. Okay, so. Let's start with the critique of Agamben. Okay, so in The Beast and the Sovereign, Derrida never talked about biopolitics before. In Faith and Knowledge, it is absent, this motive of the biopower, biopolitics. The seminar was taught in 2002. And because it is devoted to the question of sovereignty and animality, Derrida feels the need to explain himself, to have a confrontation with Foucault and Agamben about biopolitics. So this appears mainly in the 12th session, that is the last one. No, the last one. The question, the general objection Derrida makes, and then we will be more specific, is something like: is there a reason why we should distinguish the problem of sovereignty from the one of metaphysics as Heidegger defines it? Okay? You know that for Heidegger, the whole philosophical tradition is called metaphysics, right? Which means a certain discourse concerning the sovereignty of being. You know that, according to Heidegger, metaphysics proceeds from the confusion between being with a capital B and beings with a small b. Being with a capital B is nothing, does not really exist, And what metaphysics does, on the contrary, is to transform this being with a capital B, which has no concrete existence, into a being, the small b, that is, into a presence. Okay? Be it God, substance, principle, or whatever. Okay? The history of metaphysics is the history of this transformation of a being which is time. This is what Heidegger explains in Being and Time. That is nothing being with a small b. It doesn't exist. As Heidegger says, being is nowhere. It is the transformation of this kind of, temporal notion into something substantial, that is into its own contrary, that is into a substance, a God, a presence of any kind. So Heidegger was already aware of the fact, it was the first one, to show that reality had this tendency to invert itself. The proof of that is this transformation of being with a capital B into beings with a small b. Right? This tendency to substantify, to substantialize something which is, by definition, non-substantializable, non-reducible to a kind of present living being. So, Heidegger talks about destruction of metaphysics. It doesn't have the word deconstruction, but destruction of metaphysics, showing that metaphysics is destructing itself, it's a principle of self-destruction, until the point where the irreducibility of being with a capital B to being with a small b will appear, and that will switch from, will enter a new era of thinking, which won't be metaphysics or philosophy, but we will enter this era of what Heidegger calls the other thought, which is a non-metaphysical way of thinking, a thought which will be faithful to the non-presence of being with a capital B. Okay, so sorry for this summary of Heidegger's thought, but in a way, what Heidegger calls metaphysics is also something political. It is the transformation of a non-substantial kind of reality, being, with capital B, into, in a way, a sovereign presence. When you call being God or substance or principle or the world or the origin or whatever, you are conferring being, which in the beginning is nothing. You are conferring being a kind of sovereignty. You transform being into, in a way, a king. This is what metaphysics is about the domination of being understood as a being over reality. Right? So every Heidegger, in all his books, Heidegger is, let's say, deconstructing, destroying, he says, this sovereignty of being. Okay? Being is not a sovereign because it is nothing. It has no presence. Okay? So Derrida, the question of Derrida in this 12th session is, what does Foucault's critique of sovereignty, this, what we did 2 days ago, this triangle structure, Leviathan structure, okay? And then the passage from this sovereign structure to biopolitics as a new form of sovereignty. This is what does it add to Heidegger's critique of metaphysics? Okay? After all, the critique of sovereignty is a part of the Heideggerian destruction of metaphysics. I don't see the point, Derrida says, in developing a political critique of sovereignty, because Heidegger had already done it. Heidegger has already given us all the critical weapons to deconstruct sovereignty. Okay? even if Heidegger is not talking directly about Hobbes or Leviathan, etc., it's very easy to deduce the triangle structure, kingship, etc. It's very easy to to derive this political critique from Heidegger's ontology and critique of metaphysics. Okay, so biopolitics and sovereignty in Foucault and Agamben is nothing new. This will be the fundamental argument of Derrida in the Beast and the Sovereign. Nothing new. It doesn't add anything to what Heidegger already said. So it's very violent. The two last chapters are extremely critical. Says biopolitics is nothing new. Heidegger has already described it under the name of metaphysics. It's just an aspect of metaphysics, nothing different. So I don't see the point in constituting the critique of sovereignty into a specific political problem, specifically political, because it is a metaphysical problem. So you have, I let you read the 12th section, which is all about Heidegger and, well, this confrontation between metaphysics and sovereignty. And then Derrida comes to Agamben more specifically and the difference between bios and Zoe, but in the same line of critique, saying the distinction Agamben introduces does not bring anything new to the Heideggerian discourse. So I read from page 325 in the English translation, which is 433, I think, in the French. It's written in the margin. So it's the last paragraph. The whole difficulty depends on the fact that Agamben wants absolutely to define the specificity of modern politics or biopolitics, which Foucault makes his theme at the end of The Will to Knowledge, and at least the possibility of which Heidegger, let's say, didn't fail to think. So it's ironic, of course, Derrida saying, of course, Heidegger has already defined what biopolitics was. Agamben wants absolutely to define this specificity by putting his money on the concept of bare life, which he identifies with Zoe in opposition to bios. It is even this specificity that Foucault, who died too soon, supposedly missed. And already in the expression biopolitics, to which Agamben would no doubt have preferred zoopolitics. Agamben writes, Foucault's death kept him from showing how he would have developed the concept and study of biopolitics, which Agamben does by adding or exploring developments missed by Foucault. Agamben continues, and this is a quote from Homo Sacer. In any case, however, the entry of Zoe into the sphere of the polis, the politicization of bare life as such, constitutes the decisive event of modernity and signals a radical transformation of the political, philosophical categories of classical thought. It is even likely that if politics today seems to be passing through a lasting eclipse, it is because politics has failed to reckon with this foundational event of modernity. I will go on a little bit. I repeat or paraphrase. In Agamben's own words, politics is subject today to a lasting eclipse, he says, but we don't know whether it's politics, the thing, political life, political history, or the discourse on politics. And if politics is today subject to a lasting eclipse, but lasting since when? Until when? It's only probable, says Agamben, and due to what? Well, to a forgetting. Politics, the political thing, or the thinking of politics, has forgotten. What? The founding event of modernity, namely what founds modern politics and what politics has forgotten. Now, what does this founding event consist in? in, I quote again, the introduction of Zoe, audaciously translated as bare life, and therefore life without qualities, without qualification, the pure and simple fact of living and of not being dead, life as merely life, as the stubborn people mocked by Heidegger were saying that Sinnigen ist Leben nur Leben. Now, what does this founding event consist in? And I quote again, the introduction of Zoe into the sphere of the polis. To show this, Agamben is required to demonstrate that the difference between Zoe and bios is absolutely rigorous already in Aristotle. Can he do this? Before proceeding down this path, I should like to take a precaution. My questions or my reservations here, whether directed toward Foucault or more precisely here toward Agamben, don't mean that I have no interest in anything that could be called a specificity in the relations between the living being and politics, in what these authors so calmly call modernity. New things are certainly happening in this respect today. Okay? I'll stop here. The last sentence is extremely ironic. New things are certainly happening in this respect today. Okay? What Derrida challenges here, you understand, is the supposed novelty of biopolitics, first of all. The emergence of biopolitics, remember, Foucault situates it at the turn of the 17th century, so this is the event of modernity. So Derrida challenges this, the modernity of biopolitics, and more specifically in Agamben, this foundational event, which he says in a very ironic way, which is the introduction of Zoe into bios, the confusion between bios and Zoe we were talking about yesterday. Okay? And it's very ironic because, well, nothing new. Derrida says nothing new. What they call this event of modernity is the emergence of biopolitics and the introduction of Zoe. You remember the excluded Zoe, which now is manifest because we know since Nazism that Zoe and bios are conflating, are one and the same today. Derrida says, in fact, nothing new. Okay? The distinction between Zoe and bios is not rigorous. Okay? This is absolutely ironic and very violent. Nothing new. It's not a foundational event. And the distinction between bios and Zoe is not rigorous, in fact. So you can read all that page and all the 12th session as this ironic mode. They insist on the novelty of their discoveries, Foucault and Agamben, but in fact, nothing new in that. So, I will omit here the nothing new in relation to Heidegger. Like, why does Derrida affirm that, in fact, Agamben and Foucault are not bringing anything new to Heidegger's analysis of metaphysics? I will insist more on why the distinction between Zoe and bios, according to Derrida, is not rigorous. Why does he say that? It is the same logic than the one we were talking about a moment ago. He says, Agamben introduces the notion of Zoe as the pure fact of living, as natural life, biological life, in opposition to bios, which is qualified life. You remember what we said yesterday. But Derrida will argue in the end of the book that if we really want to confer a reality to Zoe, if we want it to be something else than a pure concept, that's something totally abstract, because Derrida says, I don't see what is the materiality of Zoe, I don't see what the necessity of distinguishing from bios is, if we want to confer a reality to this Zoe, then we have to take it seriously, etymologically. Zoon, the living being, that is mainly the animal. Okay? He said it is very strange that Agamben introducing Zoe into the domain of life, and say we have to distinguish Zoe from Bios. It's very strange that it does not go accomplish the etymological gesture which relates Zoe to Zoon, which is the animal. So if Zoe has a meaning, it is animal life. It is not their life. It is not natural life only. It is really animal life. And it's true that in Greek, this is Zoe, you know, we said yesterday it was the same roots than zoology. So it is true that it means originally the animal life. What is sovereignty then, according to Derrida? I keep that into your mind. Why does Agamben avoid the question of the animal? What is sovereignty? The beast and the sovereign means that the sovereign is a beast. Sovereignty, according to Derrida, equates bestiality, not animality. And you have a very strong distinction in the book between animality and bestiality. Bestiality is only human. And Derrida says an animal never behaves like a beast. A beast is a monster that is something or someone cruel, acting without ethics, okay? Acting without any moral restriction. And sovereignty, according to Derrida, means that the sovereign act as a beast at the very moment, when he affirms his superhumanity, Derrida says. The sovereign is this human being which affirms his sovereignty in behaving not like an animal, but like a beast. Okay? So hence the title, The Beast and the Sovereign. To be a sovereign is to have the right to kill and to behave in a bestial way, and is to kill life, in order to affirm his superhumanity. Derrida says that on page 281. So sovereignty is this excess of bestiality over animality. Okay, you understand the difference between the two. To act as a beast, well, only a human being can behave like a beast. Okay? Bestiality is in fact reserved to humanity. An animal is not a beast, and he quotes many texts on that, particularly Rousseau and other philosophers who really distinguish between the animal and the beast. So sovereignty is linked with bestiality, which is the right, the sovereign right to behave without any moral restriction, like a beast, in order to affirm one's superiority. And the critique of Agamben is all the more violent, that he says. Then, to talk about, I will reveal you the violence of the argument, which is incredible. To talk about Zoe, without talking about the animal, right? To talk about Zoe, to introduce the notion of Zoe without even mentioning the animal, all right? Which is true. It is true that Homo sacer, we said that yesterday, doesn't, I think the word animal is never mentioned, only when Agamben says that the Nazis were considering Jews as animals. But outside of that, you don't have any development of animal life. And Derrida will have this argument, I'm summarizing, but to put that, a long story short, to talk about Zoe without mentioning the animal is to behave like a what? Like a beast. Okay? Like a beast. The bestiality of... It's incredible. The bestiality, but it's interesting. It's interesting. The bestiality of the discourse of Agamben consists in this eclipse of animality. Okay? Consists in the fact that you talk about Zoan, the living being, and Derrida, you remember, said perhaps Agamben would have preferred the word zoopolitics to biopolitics. No. The fact of talking about Zoan, to insist upon the importance of Zoe without even mentioning the animal. And Derrida says it is behaving like a beast, that is like a sovereign. In fact, what Agamben's critique of sovereignty is the very expression of sovereignty. It's the very repetition of the sovereign act of bestiality. But here, sovereignty consists in negating the animal at the very moment when you insist on the importance of Zoe. Which is very, very interesting because at the same time it is not, well, it is true. It is true that we can be surprised to witness the total absence of animality in Homo sapien. Okay? Agamben, you remember, he says in the first page, Zoe is the simple fact of living common to man, God, and animals. But then afterward, in all the following pages, it's all about human life. Okay? It never comes back to other forms of life. So Derrida says, then, you understand the argument, the critique of sovereignty is at the same time a sovereign act. It is the repetition of the sovereign act of negating life. That is, it is a way of behaving like a beast. That is negating the very materiality of life, killing life. And he says, this is what Heidegger would have replied to the critique of Agamben. And again, Derrida will come back to his notion of sacrifice again, saying it seems to be impossible to talk about life without the form of sacrifice. Okay? Look at what Foucault and Agamben are doing. They are sacrificing the very object of their discourse. Okay? They want to talk about life and they never do. Because at the very moment when they want to talk about life, well, they avoid the question of non-human life. It's always about humans. Never about... at some point also, Derrida invokes vegetal life, the life of plants, etc. And he says it is surprising to see that these thinkers who really insist on life, on the necessity to show the link between life and politics, are in a way repeating the very act, the very sovereign act of negating life. So you can see two levels of the critique. Of course, it is a critique ad hominem, that is, it is a critique of Agamben, like nothing new in that. But it is more generally beyond the person. It is it's pertaining to the logic we were talking about a moment ago. That is, then, when you talk about life, you're entering the mechanisms of sacrifice. Okay, you're necessarily sacrificing the very object of your research or discourse. Impossible to talk about life without exposing life to death. And then Derrida has this whole development, which is the heart of the book, about the victim of sacrifice, the most common victims of sacrifice, which are the animals. So the animals are the ones which are always sacrificed in the West, in philosophical discourse. Okay. The victims of this self-deconstructive logic, the victims of deconstruction in a way, those who suffer from this self-destruction of life are always the animals. And you have this long analysis of animal life, which is always, which is always omitted, which is always forgotten, which is always put aside, eclipsed. In and by the philosophical discourse. And he says, this is precisely what sovereignty is. And if we have a critique, if we want to develop a critique of sovereignty, we have to understand, again, what is this logic of sacrifice. And we have to understand also, and this is what is new, when we compare the Beast and the Sovereign to acts of religion, this is what is new. In the Beast and the Sovereign, Derrida is more specific about sacrifice. What is sacrifice is always animality, always. When life destroys itself, deconstructs itself, it kills its animal, let's say, materiality. What is destroyed or deconstructed or turned into its opposite, or is always animality. So I have a question for you. I don't know what you think of that. For Derrida, the vitality of life, the materiality of life, is always animality. Okay? It is the most elementary definition of life. And it is also what is exposed to death. It is also the origin of the self-sacrificial movement.
When you say that it is new in the Beast of the Sovereign that sacrifice is sacrifice of the animal life and solely, is because in the other one he says the opposite. No? From what I understand, the other one he says.
In where?
In Faith and Knowledge.
Yes.
He says the sacrifice is sacrifice not only of natural life, but also that which is worth more than so-called natural life. So he changes position. It's not that he specifies.
Well, not exactly, because in The Beast and the Sovereign, it shows that this more than life, which is the symbolic, you're right, to mention this, but the symbolic in The Beast and the Sovereign appears in the animal itself. You see what I mean? The phenomenal manifest character of the sacrifice is revealed in the animal, by the animal. So you will perhaps also ask, why not the plants? Because Derrida says we cannot really talk about the sacrifice of the plant. There's no vegetal sacrifice. Well, we could discuss also about that. But he says it is always, well, the most manifest character of this exposure, self-exposure of life to death is in animal life. And we can understand what plant life is, or zoe in general, even human life, from the animality. So he doesn't really change his mind, but I think he specifies that both the symbolic and the biological are, in a way, rooted in the animal. So you see, he says, and he also reproaches that to Heidegger, because for Heidegger, you mentioned that the stone has no world, and the animal is foreign world, etc. Heidegger never really takes animal life into account. So this is also a critique he addresses to Heidegger. But you see what he does, he says, there is nothing new in Foucault and Agamben, and anyway, the general critique we can address, this omission of animal life is common to Heidegger, Foucault, and Agamben. So nothing new in Zoe and nothing new in the critique. It's the same critique. It is the same critique that we can address to Foucault, Heidegger, and Agamben. So in that sense, we have the same conclusion that there's nothing new in that. But what is new for Derrida is the urge to think of animal life as being the very materiality of life, and at the same time, the point of emergence of the symbolic, the more than life. Because the animal, when I see the animal, I can almost see, I don't know if the verb is correct, but almost see the self-exposure of life to death. But you see the argument is that, well, if you talk about Zoe, the importance of Zoe, without talking about the animal, then you repeat the sacrifice. You repeat the very sovereign act of omitting animal life, killing animal life. And then he compares the forgetting of the animal to this great, lesson of anatomy. I don't know if you've read this chapter in The Beast and the Sovereign. It's on 277. How do you say that in English when you disséquer, when you open and then
Dissect.
Dissect. So, and dissection? Dissection of the elephant, Louis XIV. Well, it was the first time, I think, an elephant was introduced in Paris, and it was killed and dissected in front of Louis XIV. It was like a big spectacle in Paris, a big show. This poor elephant being cut into pieces in front of the king. So it's the 11th session. Derrida talks about autopsy and this elephant. Let me see. Yeah, Susan. I'm just looking for a small passage we could read. Where is this elephant
The one about
thing?
the elephant, it's 281.
281, yeah.
And then number 2.
Yeah, thank you. The scene of knowledge is as phenomenal as the elephant. This is a phenomenal beast, a phenomenal elephant, i.e. an object that appears in its finest type as manifestation to the gaze, not only of the learned observers, but of a sun king, the king of light and the source of light. A king who is the condition of possibility of appearing and of knowledge, a phenomenological, phenomenological king, source and producer of light, who from most high, like Plato's good, sun and Agamben, gives being and appearing to things. You see the sovereign as the act of witnessing and seeing and killing the animal. Here, everything is subject to the Sun King. Knowledge and being and the phenomenal elephant is both subject and object under the king's gaze. The king keeps, owns, has in his possession the immense beast. He has the immense cadaver at his disposal, like an object for his power, for his knowledge, for his having and his seeing, and for his pleasure. Okay? So this is I think the whole chapter is about that sovereignty as this act of imposing one's own power over the animal, the dead animal. So the origin of sovereignty. And by the same token, the king is acting like a beast.
Does he talk about the
sorry?
analogy of the words autopsy at all?
What?
He doesn't really, does he talk about?
See, yes, to autopsy, it's on 276. What is an autopsy? Autopsia. What is an autopsy of oneself?
Because the etymology, does he talk about, because it means the act of seeing with one's own eyes.
Yes.
It really literally means witnessing.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, it's related to the gaze.
Yeah.
Autopsy. It's a kind of cutting, which is at the same time of seeing.
And in ancient Greek, it was used. It was referred to as the person who witnessed. It really
Interesting.
is a person. Because auto-ops and optical and witnessing with your own eyes, and so it was used in like a court idea of the person who witnessed something actually happening. There's a really interesting film that's on bracket that uses that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What is this?
There's a film by Stan Brackett.
Yes. What was the name?
It's called The Act of Seeing with One's Own Eyes.
Okay.
Well, it's all
I like him very much.
It's all footage of autopsies. It's really gruesome, but
Oh, thank you for that.
but
And is it about animals?
no, it's human autopsies.
Oh.
But it uses that. It picks apart the etymology of that word. I'm surprised that he doesn't. I'm surprised that he doesn't.
I think he does. I think he does. I think he does.
Starts off with that.
But he's not really going into the.
Into the etymology?
Yeah, into the.
I'm not sure it does.
Into the specificity of autopsy, really meaning witness.
Anyway, it's very interesting. Thank you. I think he does somewhere, because he talks about the gaze, etc., about optical experience.
Oh yeah, and he says something about the gaze cast on physical objects.
So I think he does somewhere. But anyway, yeah, it's very interesting, and so we have to understand why autopsy is the sovereign act by excellence. That is, when you look at something, when you have this gaze, at the same time you kill. It is a kind of gaze which kills precisely life. What kills here is very manifest animal life. So this is yes.
One thing that kind of bothered me a little bit about
Yes.
this text and this critique of Agamben, and I apologize if I can't quite phrase it correctly, is that it seems to me that, and maybe it's a naive point, but that these are two totally different levels in a sense, the actual killing of the elephant versus the exclusion from discourse. And maybe that, to some extent, that complaint sort of replicates the distinction between the symbolic and the biological. But I wonder if on another level, making them exactly equal in terms of sovereignty does sort of replicate the distinction between the biological and the symbolic by saying that they're not just different levels of the biological or the material, by saying that they're exactly equal and parallel, in a sense makes them distinct or replicates that distinction between the biological and the symbolic?
Who makes that equal?
Derrida, in saying that Agamben replicates the exact same thing.
Oh, okay.
And by making them exactly equivalent, also makes them distinct. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And yeah. So are you criticizing this?
Just, yeah, there's something about what Derrida is saying that just doesn't sit quite right with me.
Yeah, because according to Derrida, the critique of biopolitics is the exact repetition, a bit displaced, but still the exact repetition of the classical act of sovereignty. You're right. So the section of the elephant and the introduction of Zoe without mentioning animal life are one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
In a way. I mean,
Yeah.
Of course there are transitions, but let's say that yes, it is the nerve of the argument. And that when it comes to the king's two bodies, in 285, the king's two bodies, he says, well, that Agamben and Foucault are repeating the distinction between the two bodies. Okay, so there's a long analysis of the Cantorvit's book, the King's Two Bodies 285 and following. The king performs his own two bodies, he says. And in a way, you're right, he says, nothing is really displaced in Foucault and Agamben, because none of them mentions the animal. And so in that sense, it is as if they were talking about life, as if they were talking about symbolic life only, leaving aside the materiality of life. So it's the repetition of the two bodies. So what I don't understand in your question is what is disturbing you in that, what disturbs you in that?
The sort of the equivalence between the actual death
Yes.
of the elephant and Agamben just not
Mentioning animal life.
It just seems like they
They're
have
not-
this instinct that these two things cannot be commensurable, that they have to be different levels. And it seems that Derrida is saying that the violence of one is equivalent to the violence of the other.
So I think he would agree with you, you're quite right, it's not the same level. But I think he would agree with you, he would have agreed with you on that. But he would have said, yes, but I'm expecting the transition and the explanation of why it is not at the same level. This is what Foucault and Agamben should have explained, and this is what they didn't explain. So that's why Derrida can do the parallel, because I don't see what in their discourses resists this assimilation. See what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay? So of course it's not the same level, and Derrida is quite aware of that. But he says, yes, but you have to give me then the transition. You have to explain why it's not the same thing. And I don't see, well, if I look at your books, Foucault and Agamben, I don't see what would, in the last instance, be for you the radical difference between your discourse and the behavior of the king. Mm-hmm. So do you have other questions on that point? So then, Derrida then will say, we have to do something with this sacrifice, with this tendency of life to sacrifice itself. We see that self-destruction principle functioning at every level. We see it function in life itself, self-exposure to death, and we see it functioning in discourse also. Because if we read a book, even a deconstructive one, even a critical one, like for example Homo sapien or a history of sexuality, we find the same sacrificing logic. We always find this contradiction thing. We can turn everything into its contrary. So that's why it is so difficult to talk about life, because every time we will talk about life, we will kill something, someone, something. We will enter this logic of sacrifice. So, is it possible, for example, to talk about animals? If we admit that the very materiality of life is animality, is it possible to talk about animals without killing them, in a way or another, concretely or symbolically, like in discourse? Is it possible? Is it possible to talk about life, to talk about the animals without committing a murder, without behaving like beasts? Is it possible to talk about life very simply? And Derrida says, no, it is not possible. We have to know that it is not possible, and this is because it is not possible that we have to do it. Nevertheless, it is our responsibility. We have to be aware that this logic of the sacrifice is inevitable, because it is the symbolic dimension of life. It is the more than life, which is, it is not a decision of me, Derrida, it is because it is the very movement of life. So then we have to find the right discourse on life, including a discourse which would be able to include its own impossibility to talk about its object. Okay? We have to produce a discourse which is both a discourse on life and a discourse on the impossibility to talk about life without killing it. Okay? We have to invent this kind of course, this discourse cannot be biology. You understand why? Because biology is clearly on the side of killing. It's Louis XIV, etc. Autopsy zoology, and for Derrida, there's no fundamental difference between the 17th century zoology and contemporary genetics. The same thing. So this discourse cannot be biology. It cannot really be philosophy either, because philosophy, as he shows when he talks about Agamben, Heidegger, and all the philosophers he mentions in the book, and there are many, philosophy never really took animality into account. So philosophy is not a satisfactory discourse it's not sufficient discourse to produce this logic of life and impossibility of life. So it says the only possible discourse is a form of poetry. Okay? We have to find a way of what is the only speech, the only kind of discourse which is both possible and impossible, which takes its own impossibility as its center. For example, when Malabou says, the rose is the absence of the rose, okay, something like that. What is the only discourse which is not bothered by its own negativity, in a way, which can say, well, yes, the rose is the absence of the rose. And Derrida says it is poetry. It's not philosophy, it's poetry. Poetry is the only discourse which is absolutely aware of the sacrificial dimension of language. And that's why, you remember I said that 2 days ago, that's why in the end, Derrida says the only way of talking about the animal is poetry, because animals, in fact, in the last instance, are poems. And now you understand what it means. It's not something simple. You need the whole transition to understand why he can say that. He can say that. So, in conclusion, I tried to present a series of aporias concerning life and the distinction between the symbolic and the biological, three paths toward this, the suppression of this distinction, Foucault, Agamben, and Derrida. And in the end, what Derrida says is that, okay, certainly there's no way of taking the materiality of life into account, because every time we try, we kill it, we miss it. So in fact, perhaps the distinction between the symbolic and the biological is inevitable, and you can't really get over it. Or, but perhaps the best way of accepting it, of admitting it, is to admit that talking about life can only be a poetic gesture. That we have to produce a kind of discourse. Well, and also I find that also very interesting. In fact, only a poetic discourse could well, the animal demands to be thought of poetically. You know? There's no other way. And Derrida says biology is missing the question of the animal. Philosophy is also missing it. Critique is missing it. Everything is dismissing or killing the very object that it wants to talk about. Perhaps only a certain kind of poetry, of course, would be able to face the problem of life. Okay? And I find that, I must say, very, very interesting and very profound, and perhaps in the last instance we were talking about the difference between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. It's perhaps this poeticity of discourse which marks the difference. The necessity at some point to admit that our concepts are insufficient and that we need to open a poetical dimension within discourse in order to touch life. So my question is, I can't, I think this is extremely powerful, and I don't see how I could, how I modestly could pretend, could assume that I can criticize this, because I think it's very powerful. And yet, I wonder if this poetical approach to life is not precisely what we were talking about yesterday, this opening of a non-determined space, a space of indeterminacy within life. If this poeticity, let's say, is not opened by life itself within life, what we're talking about, like epigenetics, as this self-opening of life to its own indeterminacy, I wonder if we couldn't not oppose, but let's say ask Derrida if really poetry is this more than life, is something which transcends the very materiality of life, or else if it is not immanent to life itself, if it is not in fact, if it is not life itself, something which wouldn't be more than life, something which wouldn't excess life or transgress life, but something which would be just life itself, without any excess, we wouldn't have to evoke any kind of transcendence or more than. So, as a conclusion, I will say that perhaps epigenetics, what is called currently epigenetics, but which will change, as I said yesterday, perhaps tomorrow it will be something else, but at the moment, perhaps epigenetics is what is the inscription of poetry within life. This is not something different from life, it is not this more than, but perhaps it is the very, well, the poetry of life is perhaps its very materiality, no distinction. There would be no distinction between them. Okay? Because if we say that only poetry understood as a discourse, understood as something more than life, can talk about life, then perhaps we repeat the same gesture of sacrifice. Because we need to get out of life, to transcend life in order better to talk about it. So perhaps it's another kind of sacrifice. Okay, anyway, I'm done with that. So, now I want a picture